Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 conductors whose remakes blew it. Yeah, they just sucked, or they just weren't as good as the first time around. I was thinking about this recently because, in my series on mediocre Mahler, the mediocre Mahler cycle, I was talking about conductor Marcus Stenz, who did a really fine Mahler fifth, and then he went off to Cologne and did a whole Mahler cycle that was the acme of mediocrity, including the Mahler fifth. And you wonder, why do they do this? If they make a great recording of something, they make a great recording of something, what is the necessity to do another one that doesn't come out as good? Now, I'm sure they don't intend to do something that doesn't come out as good, but it doesn't come out as good, which leads us to speculate about numerous things. First, do they listen to their own work? Do they care about their own work? What do they think about? How do they evaluate a fine performance versus a not so fine performance? How much control do they exercise over the sound of the orchestra, over what's actually happening in the performance? How much does the commercial aspect, that is what the record company wants or what they're willing to pay for, enter into the calculation? Does a conductor care about his own legacy? I mean, all of these questions come up in considering this, and a remarkable number of conductors have had the opportunity to record the same music more than once, and in all of those cases, I mean, without exception, we can compare. And we can draw conclusions, and some will be better and some will be worse. So here are 10 examples of conductors who did remakes. They did remakes at the behest of their record labels, maybe because they thought they did. They had something new to bring to the party, and they didn't. They didn't bring it at all. And of course, they didn't notice that they didn't bring it. Probably they didn't notice. I wonder whether they noticed or not, or whether they cared. I mean, they're all narcissistic egomaniacs anyway. So who knows? So let's start at the beginning, right? Here we go. Ormandy, Eugene Ormandy in Philadelphia's Pictures in an Exhibition. Now, their Sony stereo recording is the iconic reference edition for Pictures in an Exhibition. It's just a recording where just about everything went perfectly, and it sounds great. And he redid it for RCA, and it's not nearly as good. It just isn't. And this is part of that push me, pull you business that happens between record labels, because a conductor records their core repertoire for one label, then they jump to another label and they do it all over again. And sometimes it will be better, and sometimes it will not be better. And especially if the conductor is sort of aging and starting to, degenerate or decay, it's not going to be as good. And that's one example. Next, Leopold Stokowski's Scheherazade. Now, his best one is the Decca Phase 4 Scheherazade. He recorded it 1,000,000 times. And it is because he reorchestrated it and futzed with it and did all kinds of things. And you can hear in this Phase 4 multi-mic'd extravaganza every single blip and twitch and shading, and it all has its own microphone. It sounds just marvelous, or just unspeakably vulgar and tasteless, depending on how you go. But then he remade Scheherazade, of course, for his new label, for RCA, later in life. And RCA's setup was not Decca Phase 4. It was far more natural. And it's just lackluster in comparison. I mean, it's obviously the same guy. He's using the same parts. You hear the same, silly things like the additional xylophone part and the second movement and whatnot. But it just doesn't come out as brightly. It's not as in your face, which frankly is what makes the thing work in the first place on Decca. So, No. After that, let's see who else. Oh, Solti. Poor old Solti. Okay. His initial recordings of a lot of things were in London with the London Symphony Orchestra, like Bartók and Mahler and whatnot. They were very, very good, or mostly. Some of them were very good. The Mahler third always sucked. But then he remade everything in Chicago, and especially when digital recording came around, the technology demanded that everything be redone. Like that Stokowski Scheherazade, I think, probably was in quad, if anyone cared. But Solti did Mahler 1, one of the great ones, with the London Symphony Orchestra in Chicago for Decca, and in Chicago, in London, the London Symphony Orchestra in London, obviously, for Decca. And it's fabulous. The only thing it's missing is a little bit of bass, because in those days, Decca used to roll off the bass so that, you wouldn't hear the subways rumbling under Kingsway Hall or wherever they recorded that stuff. Anyway, he remade it in digital for Chicago. And not only was it missing things like a couple cymbal crashes, but the digital recording was hideously glary and unpleasant. And the performance was roughly the same, but the sound of it was no comparison to that LSO recording. I mean, the LSO recording it just had character and color and all of these things. And the Chicago Symphony was just sort of a streamlined run-through in glary, glitzy, ugly sound with a couple missing cymbal crashes in the finale. So, yeah, it was definitely not a patch on his first effort. Then we had Karajan's Planets. Oh, yes. Karajan recorded the Planets with the Vienna Philharmonic for Decca. It was one of the great recordings of the Planets and amazingly well recorded. Just a fabulous performance, texturally aware, and it sounding like the Vienna players were having the time of their lives doing this unusual music for them. Then he remade it in for Deutsche Grammophon with the Berlin Philharmonic because he wanted to have a digital recording of the Planets. And oh, it wasn't that good. Not only wasn't it as good sonically as that Decca original, but the playing was surprisingly rhythmically iffy in places. It really was. I mean, the Berlin Philharmonic is not the most rhythmic of ensembles, or it wasn't in those days. They were used to the German standard repertoire, which is like all in 4/4 or 3/4. And after that, they sort of had difficulties. I mean, James Levine talked about famously how difficult it was to get them to play Dukas' Sorcerer's Apprentice because they just didn't know it. And it's a very tricky work. Well, the Planets is like that. It's all about counting and rhythm. And so his remake was unpleasantly recorded, another one of those early digital jobs. And Karajan used to mix his own recordings, which made it even worse because he couldn't hear high frequencies. And then the playing was just not up to snuff compared to his earlier version. Very disappointing. The same thing happened, by the way, with him in The Pines of Rome, his early Philharmonia recording, which was a knockout, and the Berlin remake, which was just sort of... ugh. All right, so much for Karajan. Andre Previn's Walton First Symphony. Now, his RCA recording is with the London Symphony is the reference edition of that work. It's amazing. It's taut. It's thrilling. It's ferocious. Well, Previn is one of those conductors who later in life, the fire in his belly just went out. It really did. Not in everything he did, but in most of the things he did. You could always count on his later version being slower and duller. And so it was with Walton's First Symphony. He did the remake for Telarc, of all labels. Telarc, fabulous sounding Telarc with the Royal Philharmonic. No, not nearly as powerful or exciting as his first recording with the LSO for RCA. And you could just make the comparison and prove it to yourself. And what happened to the tam-tam at the end? Oh, that always bothers me. When fortissimo tam-tam whacks are inaudible, it's a crime. It really is. So there's that. Then we've got Carlo Maria Giulini, who was a conductor who recorded very few. Well, I mean, he had a somewhat limited repertoire. I shouldn't say very few, if anything. But he had a somewhat limited repertoire, and he did the same stuff over and over again. That was my point. And in doing the same stuff over and over again, we have a wonderful opportunity to make boatloads of comparisons. In this case, the Franck Symphony in D minor, which he recorded somewhere around 1957, I think, with the Philharmonia for EMI. It was a really fine performance of that work. Everything Giulini did was thoughtful and sensitive and often measured in tempo, but beautifully alive and lovingly shaped. And then he redid it for Deutsche Grammophon, I think in Berlin or Vienna or somewhere. I don't know. Oh, what a snooze fest. Oh, just a thick, glutinous snooze fest, which a lot of his late work was. He was one of those guys who got slower and slower and slower and slower and slower and slower. And it got painful. And the Franck D minor is just one of those symphonies where you got to keep it moving. If it doesn't move, it just congeals. It's like the fat on top of the chicken soup the second day around. You got to skim it off. If you're going to eat it, well, No, that was a mistake. Then there's Bernard Haitink, the guy who always said people make too many recordings. Then he went on to make too many recordings of everything. Mahler 7th, his first Mahler 7th was just a fresh, lively, beautiful, texturally aware, gorgeous sounding recording, enhanced in no small degree by the special sound of the Concertgebouw Orchestra, which in those days, when Haitink first got them, had wonderfully characteristic sectional timbres. The trombones wouldn't sound like anybody else. The woodwinds were amazing, even the percussion section. Well, he made a digital remake back in the days when Philips didn't know how to make digital recordings, particularly not in the Concertgebouw, and everything was slower and heavier and duller and less detailed. It was awful. It was just awful. It's unbelievable sometimes that some of these things got released. And this was one of them. I mean, you could do an A-B comparison and how anybody could want that second recording to even see the light of day. I have no idea. And what's more, the orchestra's character had changed. As an ensemble, it had modernized in many ways, but replaced players, obviously. And that special, lovely sound, which was so good in these Mahler symphonies, especially the ones that have lots of orchestral coloristic devices, it was all poof, at least as recorded. Right there, it was just horrible. Absolutely horrible. And there's Ozawa, the late, great Seiji Ozawa, who did a dynamite Carmina Burana for RCA with the New England Conservatory Choir. It was youthful. It was earthy. It was lusty. It was rhythmic. It was terrific. Then he remade it with the Berlin Philharmonic, and it was slick and boring and just a totally unnecessary run through. You know he made that recording as a contractual obligation album, as we call them in the business. You know, they said, oh, you did such a great one for RCA. We need a new Carmina Burana, because Philips in those days was not the Carmina Burana label. I think all they had was Herbert Kegel, who was fabulous, but that was licensed from East Germany. And so they wanted to do it, and they wanted it in digital. Had to be digital. You needed to have your digibits, digibits, whatever they are. All these were digibitches because they sucked. Oh my goodness. It was a wholly uninteresting performance of Carmina Burana. Now Ozawa, I mean, he always had rhythm. He always played things, you know, it wasn't like slow and boring. It was just smoothed over and lacking in color, and all of the joy and freshness of that earlier recording was gone, nowhere. Next, Colin Davis, his RCA Sibelius cycle, symphonies and tone poems and other things. It was like 7 discs worth of stuff. One of the most embarrassing productions ever by a major artist. It was horrible in ways that was almost the ways that were impossible to quantify. It was badly played. There were mistakes everywhere, people getting lost and things missing. And it I mean, you can read the reviews over on classicstoday.com if you're curious. And I've talked about them here too. But, you know, Davis made his reputation as a Sibelian with a great Sibelius cycle in Boston, where he did all the symphonies and some other tone poems for Philips, which is now Decca. And then he did these remakes, and the sound was lousy. And I know for a fact, because I spoke to some members of the London Symphony afterwards, that they were recorded someplace not normally where they record these things, and the orchestra was having a great deal of trouble hearing itself, which is obvious everywhere. But Davis's tempos were slow. He was on Quaaludes or antidepressants. Or so I think he was, actually. He had some emotional issues. But that aside, what that did to his conducting, I don't want to even speculate. All I know is that it sounds as though he was on downers. It is a slow, boring, badly played, soggily recorded disaster of a bunch of Sibelius recordings. And after his superb earlier ones, you could only listen in horror. I mean, you could have argued, well, yeah, okay, he deserved another go-around. But didn't he listen to it? How could this have been approved for release? And what made it actually added insult to injury is that the then young Swedish conductor Jukka-Pekka Saraste had done a complete Sibelius symphonies and tone poems and incidental music thing for RCA, and it was really quite good. I mean, it had a couple faded moments, but basically it was very, very good, and that was completely swept aside in favor of these awful new Colin Davis recordings. He did redeem himself when he remade this, but that's the subject of another video. Somewhat redeemed himself. And last but not least, Leonard Bernstein, the great Lenny, whose Dvorak New World Symphony for Sony is one of the most exciting and fabulous performances of that work you'll ever hear in your life. It's the reference recording, or one of them. It's iconic. Scherzo is a thrill. It's amazing. And he redid it late in life, live with the Israel Philharmonic. Oh, God. I mean, the Largo is twice as slow. It's like, God knows, it's like 16 minutes long or something. It's insanely slow and boring. And the playing is ugh. And the sonics are dull and lousy, not nearly as good as the original Sony ones from like 40 years previously or 30 years previously. And a total, complete disaster in every possible way. It should never have been released. He should not have permitted it to be released. Of course, after he died, they would have found a way to release it anyway. I'm sure his family would have found a way to milk it for everything it was worth, because that's what they do. But, no. It was a dog, a bow wow of a performance after having done one of the great versions. And you just have to wonder, what were these people thinking? What was anybody thinking? I mean, the label didn't care, that was for sure. But the artist should. And it tells us a lot about them as a group and the music industry as we know it. So there you have it, my friends. 10 conductors who did wonderful versions of things, which they then blew later on. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me, and take care.